The desert was burning gold beneath the dying sun, a place where silence pressed against the skin heavier than any weight of steel. A lone rider cut through that silence, his horse kicking up dust that curled and swirled in the fading light. His name was Jeb Callahan, a cowboy who carried the desert's cruelty in his eyes, gray, cold, and unflinching. He wasn't a lawman, nor a drifter seeking peace. He was a man carved by violence, living by the coin of his gun, and caring little for whose blood stained the sand along the way. That evening, as shadows stretched long against the canyon walls, Jeb spotted movement in the distance. A figure moved alone, walking barefoot across the cracked ground. It was a woman, her long black braids swinging against her back, her dress torn and dusty. Even from afar, he could tell she wasn't just any woman. She was Apache, proud in the way she carried herself despite the desert's merciless bite. Her steps were slow, but her head was high, eyes fixed ahead as if the earth itself had no claim over her. Jeb pulled his horse to a halt, narrowing his gaze. Curiosity, arrogance, and a whiskey-born boldness made him swing down from the saddle. Boots crunching against the grit, he stepped into her path. "Evenin', sweetheart," he muttered, voice rough as gravel. She stopped, not flinching, not lowering her gaze. There was fire in her stare, and it burned hotter than the desert itself. "You shouldn't be here," she said in a steady voice, her words sharp with defiance. Jeb smirked, circling her like a wolf sizing up its prey. "World's a wide place. Don't reckon you got the right to tell me where I ought to be." He leaned closer, the smell of leather and gunpowder thick on him. He reached out, tugging at the front of her dress. She slapped his hand away, but he grabbed again, stronger this time. With a jerk, fabric tore under his grip, falling loose against her chest. The desert wind seemed to stop in that instant. Her tattoo, black, sharp, a sacred mark inked upon her skin, was revealed. It wasn't just decoration. To her people, it was a sign of lineage, of warriors and fire passed down through generations. By tearing her shirt, Jeb had done more than insult her body. He had spat upon her honor, her tribe, her blood. Her breath quickened, not with shame, but with fury. She pulled herself free, eyes never leaving his. "You'll pay for this," she whispered, low and steady. "Not with silver, with blood." Jeb chuckled, his laughter rolling across the canyon like a dry thunderclap. "Your people, they won't come for me. Not for this." He turned, brushing the dust from his vest as if the moment meant nothing. But behind her burning stare, a vow was already sealed. Night was coming, and with it, the desert would carry whispers, on the wind, whispers that traveled faster than a horse, faster than a bullet. By dawn, those whispers would become war cries. The fire burned low outside the cowboy's camp, throwing flickering shadows against the jagged desert rocks. He leaned back on his saddle, chewing a strip of dried meat, thinking only of his own survival. To him, what had happened earlier was nothing more than another rough encounter on the frontier. A woman who had crossed his path, a moment of dominance to remind her who carried the revolver. He laughed bitterly into the night, telling himself she would vanish into the dust like so many others. But the desert was never silent for long. Somewhere beyond the dunes, faint drums began to echo. At first, he thought it was just the wind slapping against hollow stone. But soon the rhythm grew stronger, deeper, steady like the beating of 1,000 hearts. The cowboy frowned, tightening his grip on his pistol. He remembered her eyes, the Apache woman. Most men would beg or collapse under shame. But she had stood tall, her braids hanging like black ropes, her voice calm when she spoke. "You'll see me again. Not alone." The cowboy spat into the sand, trying to shake off the memory. Yet unease gnawed at his chest. He threw more wood on the fire, but the flames seemed smaller than before, fragile against the vast, waiting darkness. Hours crawled by. Coyotes howled from the cliffs, and the night air grew cold. He pushed himself up, eyes narrowing at the horizon. It rolled forward like a storm, and within it, faint glimmers of steel. Spears, rifles, 200 warriors. The cowboy's throat went dry. He had faced gunmen, bounty hunters, soldiers, but this was different. This was vengeance riding on horseback, swift and unstoppable. At the head of the formation rode the Apache woman, her torn dress now replaced with ceremonial hides, her chest tattoo blazing like a war symbol in the morning sun. She raised her hand, and the drums ceased. Silence crushed the desert. The cowboy finally understood. He had not shamed her. He had declared war. The desert night pressed heavy, the kind of silence that carried hidden sounds. Coyotes cried in the distance, and the wind whispered across the cliffs like voices of the dead. The cowboy sat by his campfire, boots propped against a rock, chewing on a strip of jerky as if the world owed him peace. He told himself the Apache woman's burning stare meant nothing. She had cursed him, true, but he had laughed it off. He had seen curses before. Words never killed a man, guns did. Yet something gnawed at him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, not broken, not defeated, but blazing with a fury older than the mountains. That tattoo on her chest, black against bronze skin, seemed to move like a living thing in the firelight. He had ripped her pride, not just her clothes, and deep down, he knew that kind of insult didn't vanish with the night. His horse shifted nervously, ears twitching at sounds the cowboy could not hear. He rose, scanning the desert, low at first, then stronger. He frowned. Drums meant only one thing out here, war. By midnight, the horizon shimmered with distant points of fire. The cowboy's stomach tightened. No camp that size belonged to settlers or travelers. This was a gathering, a call to arms, and at the heart of it, he knew was her. He muttered a curse, tossed his jerky into the flames, and reached for his revolver. The steel felt cold, grounding. He had fought outlaws, soldiers, even bounty hunters who came for his head. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal. He had touched a nerve that bled into an entire people's pride. The night stretched long, haunted by drumbeats and coyote wails, faces painted with streaks of red and black, arrows blotting out the sky. When dawn broke, the desert glowed red with rising light, and a shadow spread across the horizon. Dust clouds rose, miles wide, churning like a storm. The cowboy climbed to his feet, squinting against the sun. His jaw went tight. It wasn't just a hunting party. It wasn't even a raiding band. It was an army. 200 Apache warriors rode toward him, lances gleaming, rifles strapped, war cries splitting the morning air. At their front rode the woman he had mocked, her braids flying in the wind, eyes sharp as a hawk's. She wasn't just coming for revenge. She was leading judgment, and the cowboy finally understood. This wasn't his fight against one woman. This was the price of his arrogance, and the desert had come to collect. Coyotes yipped far in the distance. The wind dragged trails of dust across the open plains, and the dying campfire cracked with a sound that reminded the cowboy of old bones snapping. He sat with his hat tipped low, a bottle in his hand, and told himself that the day had been just another encounter, nothing more. Yet in the flicker of the firelight, her eyes still haunted him. The Apache woman, the way she had not begged, not wept, not even looked at him with fear, but with a fire that pierced through his weathered skin and into his marrow. She had said no word, but her stare had been a promise, and promises like that never faded into the dust. He muttered to himself, trying to shake it off. He'd faced bounty hunters, soldiers, and bandits in his time. What could one woman do? Still, when the wind shifted, he thought he heard drums echoing far beyond the cliffs. At first he dismissed it as the bottle playing tricks on his ears. But the rhythm came again, low and steady like the beating of a giant heart. He stood, hand resting on his revolver, scanning the horizon. The desert looked empty, but the darkness had a way of hiding armies until it was too late. The old horse beside him stamped nervously, nostrils flaring. Animals always knew before men. The cowboy cursed under his breath and fed another log to the fire. Nothing out there, he lied to himself. But deep inside, he felt the shift in the air. Hours dragged on, and sleep refused to come. When the first sliver of dawn lit the canyon walls, a cloud of dust rose on the horizon, stretching wide as the desert itself. The cowboy's eyes narrowed. Through the haze, dark shapes emerged, riders. Dozens upon dozens, their war cries carried on the morning wind. Spears glinted, rifles caught the rising sun. At their head rode the woman. The same torn dress clung to her frame, but now she sat tall and unbroken, hair braided like a crown, face painted with the black and red of vengeance. She raised her hand high, and the thunder of hooves answered. The cowboy's mouth went dry. The desert night wrapped itself in silence. broken only by the sigh of the wind that carried dust across the rocks. The cowboy sat by his fire, the flames dancing in his tired eyes. His boots stretched toward the warmth. He thought himself alone, far from consequence, far from the sharp gaze of the Apache woman, whose pride he had torn just hours earlier. He had laughed then, his hand ripping her shirt, but the ember of her anger had not died. It had found dry grass, and it was already spreading into a firestorm. He chewed slowly on a strip of jerky, his revolver resting on his knee. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, but underneath that sound came something deeper, something stranger. Drums, low, steady, pulsing like a heartbeat in the earth. The cowboy froze, his jaw tightening. He knew those rhythms. They were not the random echoes of nature. For the first time in years, a chill crawled up his back. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, perhaps just his imagination, stirred by the anger still blazing in the woman's eyes. Yet even as he muttered curses under his breath, his hand checked the cylinder of his Colt, spinning it, assuring himself the bullets were there, waiting. Far across the plains, beneath a sky lit by a sickle moon, the Apache woman stood tall among her people. Her torn dress had been replaced by garments of her own, choosing leather and beadwork, symbols of defiance. The firelight painted her face in copper and gold, her braid coiled over one shoulder like a serpent ready to strike. She did not beg for vengeance, she demanded it. She told them of the insult, the violation, the hand of a white man tearing not just her clothing, but the dignity of her people. The sound of their agreement was like thunder rolling across the desert. His instincts, sharpened by years of violence, whispered a warning he could not ignore. He scanned the horizon, nothing but shadows and silence. Still, unease gnawed at him. He poured himself a measure of whiskey, swallowed hard, and told himself tomorrow would be like every other day. Yet when he lay down upon the cold ground, the last thing he heard was not the crackle of the fire, but the distant echo of a war cry carried by the wind. And though he tried to sleep, he could not, for somewhere in his bones, he already knew the next day, the desert would not be his friend. It would be his judge. The fire burned low, and the desert night breathed with a coldness that gnawed at bones. The cowboy sat near the flames, polishing his revolver with steady hands. He told himself he had nothing to fear. He had stared down men with quicker hands and sharper eyes than the girl he'd shamed that afternoon. Yet in the silence between the crackling wood and the whisper of wind, his mind replayed her face, not the softness of it, but the fury in her eyes. She had not looked beaten. She had looked like a promise. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes howled, their cries carrying across the canyon walls. Then, beneath it, faint but steady drums. At first he thought it was his imagination, the echo of his guilt playing tricks on him. But no, the rhythm was real, low, rolling, like thunder beyond the horizon. He stood, scanning the dark ridges of the desert. Torches flickered faintly far off, like stars scattered across the sand. Shadows moved. Riders, dozens of them, maybe more. He cursed under his breath and reached for his rifle. The horse snorted nervously, hooves striking against the dry ground as if it to sense the coming storm. The cowboy tried to calm himself with whiskey, but the drink did nothing to steady the gnawing in his gut. His hand kept drifting to the torn scrap of fabric he had pulled from the woman earlier that day. He had kept it without knowing why, some cruel trophy, perhaps. Now it felt heavy, like a curse. He threw it into the fire. The cloth curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The night seemed to grow darker as it burned. The drums grew louder. His blood ran cold. He counted the flickering shapes on the horizon and stopped. When the number grew to high, 200, maybe more. Warriors armed with rifles, bows, and lances, moving as one under the command of the woman he had mocked. The cowboy spat into the dust, forcing steel into his voice though his chest tightened with dread. So, they're coming. And from the dark, as if in answer, the sound of hooves thundered like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The Apache woman's vengeance had begun, and the cowboy understood. Tomorrow would not be a simple fight for survival. It would be a reckoning written in blood and dust. The night had fallen heavy across the desert, a blanket of heat and silence broken only by the hiss of wind pushing fine grains of sand across the campfire. The cowboy sat slouched against a rock, hat tilted low, the ember of his cigarette glowing like a dying star. He thought himself alone, untouchable. The woman he had humiliated earlier was long gone. He told himself probably. Vanished into the darkness like a shadow swallowed by the desert. He chuckled under his breath. Yet deep inside, the echo of that stare gnawed at him. Something he tried to bury beneath whiskey and smoke. But the desert never kept secrets for long. From far beyond the ridge came a sound, a low thrum that didn't belong to the night. At first it was faint, like distant thunder. The cowboy squinted through the smoke, ears straining. Then it came again, steadier, louder. The rhythmic pound of drums carried on the wind. His fingers tensed on the grip of his revolver. "Damn Apaches," he muttered, spitting into the dust. He thought of the woman again. The way she had held her head high even when he ripped her garment. He had meant to break her spirit. But perhaps he had awakened something far more dangerous. The sound grew, spreading like fire across the canyon walls. Shadows danced against the cliffs, flickering with the light of torches that dotted the horizon. Then, as if the night itself had a voice, a chorus of war cries ripped through the silence. The cowboy rose to his feet, the cigarette falling from his lips. His horse stamped nervously, ears twitching at the coming storm. And there, against the moonlit sky, he saw them riders, dozens at first, then more, their spears gleaming, their banners snapping in the wind. At the head of the column rode the woman, no longer the captive he thought broken, but a commander, her braided hair flying like a banner of war, symbols of her people's strength. In her hand, she carried a lance tipped with obsidian that glistened under the moonlight. Her eyes found him across the distance, unblinking, merciless. The cowboy felt his throat tighten. He had faced outlaws, bounty hunters, 200 warriors, their horses thundering against the sand, poured into the valley like a living tide. The ground shook beneath their weight, dust rising in choking clouds. The cowboy staggered back, whispering under his breath, "Hell's come for me." He reached for his revolver, but his hand trembled. For the first time in years, fear dug its claws into his chest. The desert had turned against him. The humiliation he had laughed off was now a war he could not escape. And as the warriors closed in, he understood the truth. The next dawn would not belong to him. The night in the desert grew heavy, the air thick with silence broken only by the restless shuffle of horses. The cowboy leaned against the rock wall of his camp, a cigar glowing faintly between his fingers. He thought the day's encounter was finished, just another clash in a life littered with violence. But in the distance, far beyond the canyon ridges, a flicker of fire burned against the black horizon. At first, he dismissed it as nothing more than travelers. Then another flame appeared, and another. Soon the entire ridgeline glowed with scattered points of light, like stars falling to earth. The Apache woman's voice echoed in his memory, the fire in her eyes when he tore her garment, the unshaken defiance on her face. She had not begged, she had not broken, she had promised. Her words, though few, had carried the weight of thunder. Now, staring at the horizon, the cowboy felt the truth claw its way into his bones. She was not alone, and her vengeance was not empty. The ground trembled faintly, a low rhythm carried on the night wind. At first it seemed like a storm far away, but the sound grew steady, like the beat of 1,000 hooves. Dust rolled across the moonlight, drifting down into the valley. From the darkness rose the shapes of warriors, painted and armed, riding with the force of a tide that could not be stopped. The cowboy stood, his cigar dropping into the dirt, his hand instinctively resting on the worn grip of his revolver. His campfire hissed as the wind grew, sparks carried into the night. He had lived through battles, ambushes, and bloodshed, but this was different. This was not a skirmish or a gunfight in some forgotten town. This was war. 200 Apache warriors were coming for him, and they would arrive with the dawn.